And I joined the OSS in 1943, and I joined in response to a request for volunteers from the Parachute Artillery, where I was at the time, to go and join a mission into France to work with the resistance. And that sounded attractive to me. I'd spent a summer in France a few years before as a student and stayed with a family, learned a little French, enjoyed it. So I thought that was a more effective use of my talents than the Parachute Artillery, perhaps. And so I joined the OSS then. A mission they called the Jedburghs operations, which was an American or British officer matched with a French officer and a radio operator of one of the three nationalities. Mine was French. And we were dropped in different parts of France to try to organize the resistance to be of support to the military. Most of us went in after D-Day. I didn't go in until August, but some of the others went into Brittany earlier. They deliberately did not want to send us too soon because they were afraid we would raise too much resistance and the Germans would cut it down, as happened in the Vercors Plateau when the French resistance rose up and the Germans slaughtered them all, quite frankly. And so there was a very careful bit of timing as to when we should go in. About a month or so ahead of the armies was the idea, so that we could get to know our people, examine the area, determine how many resistance groups there were there, bring in supplies for them, arms, explosives, that sort of thing, so that they could rise up in the later days and assist the march of the armies. The armies went a little faster than many people had anticipated, so the actual period of operation for many of the teams was a fairly short one. Because the things were going so fast. But they did contribute not only in the direct assistance to the army movements, but also to the fact that the Germans lost a large number of men who were holed up in southwestern France and were trying to get out. And they were harassed on the roads. We had a couple of ambushes in my area, and generally slowed down, and eventually most of them surrendered. So this was a substantial force taken away from the Battle of Germany, obviously. And that was essentially the mission, to work with the French resistance groups and follow up. And then when the armies rolled over us, well, we reported back to our headquarters and went on to different places. I think it's very close to one of the missions of Special Forces. Special Forces today do a lot of different things than I did then. Obviously, they do particular operations attacking certain objectives and that sort of thing, which I was not doing. I was a high-level liaison officer is what I was as a Jedburgh. I went on to a more of a, what might be called a modern-day Special Forces operation when I went up to Norway and took a team of people up there to sabotage a railroad. There was a railroad running from North Norway down to the south that the Germans were moving troops along, and we wanted to delay that movement of the troops, so they sent a Norwegian operational group, it was called. It was a group of about, we started with 30, we actually got about 15 or 20 into the mission. And we operated alone, but gathered with some of the Norwegian resistance. We lived high up in the mountains, and then we'd come down and blow up the railroad and run away as fast as we could. But that was not an effort to raise resistance generally. It was a more directed sabotage mission, which again is a typical Special Forces mission today, I think. Well, the OSS was a mixed bag of people. It had some intellectuals who were doing the analysis. It had some experts to go into countries and speak the languages fluently and act as agents, espionage, and it had people to do the more paramilitary work, which was what I was involved in and which Special Forces is particularly qualified to do. It was a combination, in other words, of all those different missions. The people who went into it, into the operational side in OSS, were people with a certain adventure. Most of them were in the military or had an association with the military when they were volunteered, but not all of them, but a number of them. And they had the various military capabilities of shooting and blowing things up and living in the field and that sort of thing that you'd expect. Very much self-reliant, and because when you were behind the lines you were on your own very much, but nonetheless it's very similar to the Special Forces concepts today, and there's no question about that. Over the years, I think the Special Forces has expanded its capabilities so that it is able to send language-qualified people into things. They do internal defense development, helping countries to strengthen their own security services. They do liaison at a high level with other national groups and forces. That really was not my function, and we did not have that function in OSS. That was left to the rest of the military to handle those kinds of problems. But now with the many, many allies, smaller allies, and with the absence in many situations of regular American forces in the neighborhood, then the Special Forces today carries a much larger mission than it used to in the old days. Well, I'm sure the training's better because I think it's more intensive and it's broader. We were given such training as we could put together. We learned how to shoot and use knives and things like that. Not that I ever used a knife in combat other than to open a ration can, but nonetheless you learned that. You learned judo and all of that. A lot of that was morale building, to confidence building and so forth. And you obviously at that turn learned how to parachute and so forth, which you had to do. We didn't have helicopters, and I'm very happy we didn't, because if the enemy had had helicopters in Norway, I wouldn't be here, that's for sure. So that has changed the nature of the operation a bit, the increased technology that you have. The aircraft you have today are much, much better than the ones we used. We used sort of converted B-24 bombers to drop us into France and Norway. And in Norway, there were the extent of their range, and we lost 2 planes because of that problem. The navigational equipment today, the weather prediction equipment today is so much better and so much more reliable that you can do things that you couldn't do at that time, and I'm delighted to see those improvements. The people, I think you have people who, you don't sign up for the Special Forces if you want to be famous, because you're going to be anonymous. And you don't sign up for the Special Forces to make money, because there isn't much money to be made. So why do you do it? You do it because you want to serve your country, and you want to have an interesting way of doing that. And certainly the Special Forces today are very much that way. And there's no question about it. That same motive was in the people who wanted to be on the front end of operations during World War II, and not back in some depot shoveling the rations around. There's no question about it. So you get people with a bent toward courage, with a conviction of patriotism, and a willingness to sacrifice if necessary and suffer for the benefit of their nation. Oh no, I've had other kinds of challenges over the years, and I joined the CIA, of course, where you get very much the same kind of attitude, that people want to go into the CIA so that they can do something interesting and valuable for their country. And so I ran into a lot of people very similar. But the Special Forces, I worked with the Special Forces in Vietnam for a considerable period. We had several teams assigned to us for a while to help develop a village defense program in the early 1960s, and worked very well with them and got along with the fellows. They were different. They were in uniform, and they stayed in uniform. And the civilians of CIA had a slightly different role, more of a political role, if you will, of negotiating with the local people and the local authorities. And the Special Forces were more used on the direct operational level to work with the local citizens in a village, for instance, in a community, to try to get their self-defense working and that sort of thing. But we worked extremely well together because there was a great deal of sympathy between the two organizations. We both didn't really like the big conventional forces all that much, and I think that brought us together in our sentiments to some extent.